Chapter 1. Story of the Door. Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile. Cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings, when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beamed from his eye. Something, indeed, which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in these silent symbols but of the after-dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages, and though he enjoyed the theatre, had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. But he had an approved tolerance for others, sometimes wondering, almost with envy, at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds, and in any extremity inclined to help rather than improve. "I incline to Cain's heresy," he used to say quaintly. "I let my brother go to the devil in his own way." In this character, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of down-going men. And such as these, so long as they came and about his chambers, he never marked a shade of change in his demeanor. No doubt the feat was easy for Mr. Utterson, for he was undemonstrative at best, and even his friendship seemed to be founded in a similar catholicy of good nature. It is the mark of a modest man to accept his friendly circle ready-made from the hands of opportunity. And that was the lawyer's way. His friends were those of his own blood or those whom he had known to the longest. His affections, like ivy, were the growth of time. They had implied no apatness in the object, hence, no doubt, the bond that united him to Mr. Richard Enfield, his distant kinsman, the well-known man about in town. It was a nut to crack for many, what these two could see in each other, or what the subject they could find in common. It was reported by those who encountered them in their Sunday walks that they said nothing, looked singularly dull, and would hail with their obvious relief the appearance of a friend. For all that, the two men put the greatest store by these excursions, counted them the chief jewel of the week, and not only set aside occasions of pleasure, but even resisted the call of business, that they may enjoy them uninterrupted. It chanced on one of these rambles, their way led them down a street in a busy quarter of London. The street was a small and what is quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. It was in the inhabitants all doing well, it seemed, and all emulously hoping to do better still, and lying out the surplus of their gains of crocheterie, so that the shop fronts stood along that thoroughfare with an air of invitation, like rows of smiling saleswomen. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its most florid charms and lay comparatively empty of a passage, the street shone out in contrast to a dingy neighborhood, like the fire in a forest, and with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger. The two doors from one corner, on the left hand going east, the line was broken by an entry of a court, and just at the points a certain sinister block of building thrust forward the gable on the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story, and a blind forehead of discolored on the upper, and a bore in every feature, the marks of a prolonged and sordid negligence. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and disdained. Tramps slouched into the recess and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop upon the steps. The schoolboy had tried his knife on the mouldings, and for close a generation no one had appeared to drive away these random victors to repair their ravages. Mr. Enfield and the lawyer were on the other side of the by-street, But when they came abreast of the entry, the former lifted up his cane and pointed. "Did you ever remark that door?" he asked, and when his companion replied with the affirmative, "It is connected in my mind," he added, "with a very odd story." "Indeed?" said Mr. Utterson, with a slight change in his voice. "And what was that?" "Well, it was this way," returned Mr. Enfield. "I was coming home from some place at the end of the world about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, and I lay my way through a part of town where there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps, street after street, and all the folks asleep, street after street, all lighted up as if for a procession, and all as empty as a church. Till at last I got into that state of mind when a man listens and begins to long for a sight of a policeman. All at once I saw two figures, one of a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, and the other a girl of maybe 8 or 10 who was walking as hard as she was able down a cross street. Well, sir, the two ran into one another naturally enough at the corner, and then came to a horrible part of the thing. For the man trampled calmly over the child's body. I left her screaming on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man. It was like some damned juggernaut. I gave a few halloa, took my heels, collared my gentleman, and brought him back to where there was already quite a group about a screaming child. He was perfectly cool and made no resistance, but I gave him one look, so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. The people who had turned out were the girl's own family, and pretty soon the doctor, for whom she had put up with it in his appearance. Well, the child was not much worse, more frightened, according to the sawbones, and there you might have supposed would be an end to it. But there was one curious circumstance. I had taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight. So had the child's family, which was only natural. But the doctor's case was what struck me. He was the usual cut and dry Packworthy, of no particular age and color, with a strong Edinburgh accent and about as emotional as a bagpipe. Well, sir, he was like the rest of us. Every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that Bones turned sick and white with desire to kill him. I knew what was in mind, just as he knew what it was in mine. And killing being out the question, we did the next best. And we told the man we could and would make us such a scandal out of this as should make his name stink from one end of London to the other. If he had any friends or any credit, we undertook that should we lose him. And all the time, as we were pitching in the red hot, we were keeping the women off him as best as we could, for they were wild as harpies. I never saw a circle of such hateful faces, and there was the man in the middle, with a kind of black sneering coolness, frightened too, I could see that, but carrying it off really like Satan. "If you choose to make the capital out of this accent," he said, "I am naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene," he said. "Name your figure." Well, we screwed him up to £100 for the child's family. He would have cleverly liked to stick out, but there was something about the lot of us that meant mischief, and at last he struck. The next thing was to get money, and where do you think he carried us but to the place with that door? Whipped out a key, went in, and presently came back with the matter of £10 in gold and a cheque for a balance of coats, drawn payable to bearer and signed with a name that I can't mention, though it's one of the points of my story. But it was a good name, at least very well known and often printed. The figure was stiff, but the signature was good for more than that if it was only genuine. I took the liberty of pointing out my gentleman, that the whole business looked apocryphal, and that a man does not, in real life, walk into a cellar door at 4 in the morning and come out with another man's cheque for close upon the £100. But he was quite easy and sneering. "Set your mind at rest," he says. "I will stay with you till the banks open and cash the cheque myself." So we all set off, the doctor and the child's father and my friend and myself, and passed the rest of the night in my chambers. The next day we had breakfasted, went in a body to the bank. I gave the cheque myself, and I said I had every reason to believe it was a forgery. Not a bit of it. The cheque was genuine. "Tut, tut," said Mr. Utterson. "I see you feel as I do," said Mr. Enfield. "Yes, it's a bad story, for my man was a fellow that nobody could have to do with. A really damnable man, and the person that drew the cheque the very pink of the properties celebrated too, and, what makes it worse, one of your fellows who to do what they call good. Blackmail, I suppose, an honest man paying through the nose of some of the capers of his youth. Blackmail House is what I call the place with the door. In consequence, though, even that, is far explaining it all," he added, and with words fell into a vein of musing. From this he recalled by Mr. Utterson asking rather suddenly, "And don't you know if the drawer of the cheque lives there?" "A likely place, isn't it?" returned Mr. Enfield. "But I happen to have noticed his address. He lives in some square or other." "And you never asked about the place in the door?" said Mr. Utterson. "No, sir, I had a delicacy," was the reply. "I feel very strongly about putting questions. It partakes too much of the style of the day of judgment. You start a question, and it's like starting a stone. You sit quietly on the top of a hill, and the way the stone goes, starting others, and presently some bland old bird, the last you would have thought of, is knocked on the head in its own back and garden, and the family to change their name. No, sir, I make a rule of mine. The more it looks like a queer street, the less I ask." "A very good rule, too," said the lawyer. "But I have studied the place myself," continued Mr. Enfield. "It seems scarcely a house. There is no other door, and nobody goes in or out of that one but once in a great while the gentleman of my adventure. There are 3 windows looking on the court of the first floor, none below. The windows are always shut, but they're clean, and then there is a chimney which is generally smoking, so nobody must live there, and yet it's not so sure, for the buildings are so packed together about the court that it's hard to say where one ends and another begins." The pair walked on again for a while in silence. Then Enfield said to Mr. Utterson, "That's a good rule of yours." "Yes, I think it is," returned Enfield. "But for all that," continued the lawyer, "there is one point I want to ask. I want to ask the name of the man who walked over the child." "Well," said Mr. Enfield, "I can't see what harm it would do. What is a man of the name of Hyde?" Said Mr. Utterson. "What sort of man is he to see?" "He is not easy to describe. There is something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why. He must be deformed somewhere. He gives a strong feeling of deformity, although I couldn't specify the point. He's an extraordinary-looking man, and yet I really came to name nothing out of the way. No, sir, I can make no hand of it. I can't describe him, and it's not I want a memory of it, for I declare I can see him this moment." Mr. Utterson again walked some way in silence and obviously under a weight of consideration. "You are sure he used a key?" he inquired at last. "My dear sir," began Enfield, surprised out of himself. "Yes, I know," said Utterson. "I know it must seem strange. The fact is, if you do not ask the name of the other party, it is because I know it already. You see, Richard, your tale has gone home. If you have been inexact at any point, you had better correct it. I think you might have warned me, returned the other with a touch of sulkiness, but I have already been particularly exact, as you call it. The fellow had a key, and what's more, he still has it. I saw him use it not a week ago. Mr. Utterson sighed deeply, but never said a word. The young man presently resumed. Here is another lesson to say nothing, he said. I am ashamed of my tongue. Let us make a bargain never to refer to this again. With all my heart, said the lawyer. I shake hands on that, Richard. Chapter 2. The Search for Mr. Hyde. That evening, Mr. Utterson came home to his bachelor house in sombre pants and sat down to dinner without relish. It was his custom of a Sunday, when this meal was over, to sit close by the fire, a volume of some dry divinity on his reading desk, until the clock of the neighboring church rang out of the hour of 12, when he would go to soberly and gratefully to bed. On this night, however, as soon as the cloth was taken away, he took up a candle and went to his business room. There he opened his safe, took from the most private part of it a document endorsed on the envelope as Dr. Jekyll's will, and sat down with a clouded brow to study the contents. The will was a holograph, for Mr. Utterson, though he took charge of it now was made, had refused to lend the least assistance in the making of it. It provided not only that, in a case of decease of Henry Jekyll, M.D., D.C.L., LL.D., F.R.S., etc., all his possessions were to pass unto the hands of his friend and benefactor Edward Hyde. But that case, in a case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months, the said Edward Hyde should step into the said Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay and free from any burthen or obligation beyond the payment of a few small sums to the members of the doctor's household. This document had long the lawyer's eyesore. It offended him both as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life, to whom the fanciful was immodest. And hit Harrow, it was his ignorance of Mr. Hyde that swelled his indignation. Now, by a sudden turn, it was his knowledge. It was already bad enough when the name was but a name of which he could learn no more. It was worse when it began to be clothed up upon with detestable attributes, and out of the shifting, insubstantial mists that had so long baffled his eye, there were leaped up the sudden, definite resentment of a fiend. I thought it was madness, he said, as he replaced the obnoxious paper in the safe, and now I began to fear it as a disgrace. With that, he blew out his candle, put on a greatcoat, and set forth in the direction of the Cavendish Square, and that citadel of medicine, where his friend, the great Dr. Lanyon, and his house, and received his crowding patients. If anyone knows, it will be Lanyon, he had thought. The solemn butler knew and welcomed him. He was subjugated to no stage of delay, but ushered direct from the door to the dining room, where Dr. Lanyon sat alone over his wine. This was a hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman with a shock of hair prematurely white and a boisterous and decided manner. At sight of Mr. Utterson, he sprang up from his chair and welcomed him with both hands. The geniality, and as was the way of the man, was somewhat theatrical to the eye, but it reposed on genuine feeling. For those two were old friends, old mates, both at school and college, both thorough respecters of themselves and of each other. And what does it not always follow men who thoroughly enjoyed each other's company? After a little rambling talk, The lawyer led up to the subject which so disagreeably preoccupied his mind. "I suppose, Lanyon," he said, "you and I must be the two oldest friends that Henry Jekyll has." "I wish the friends were younger." "But I suppose we are. And what of that? I see a little of him now." "Indeed," said Utterson. "I thought you had a bond of common interest." "We had," was the reply, "but it was more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. I began to go wrong in mind, and though, of course, I continue to take interest in him for old sake, as they say, I have seen little of the man. Such unscientific balderdash," added the doctor, flushing suddenly purple, "would have estranged Damon and Pythias. This little spirit of temper was somewhat of a relief to Mr. Utterson. They have only differed on somewhat point of science, he thought, and being a man of no scientific passions, except the matter of conveyancing, he even added, it was nothing worse than that. He gave his friend a few seconds to recover his composure, and then approached the question he had come to put. "Did you ever come across a portage of his one Hyde?" he asked. "Hyde?" repeated Lanyon. "No, never heard of him since my time." That was an amount of information that the lawyer carried back with him in the great dark bed on which he tossed to and fro, until the small hours of the morning began to grow large. It was the light of little ease to his tolling mind, tolling in mere darkness and beside by questions. 6 o'clock struck the bells of the church that was so conveniently near Mr. Utterson's dwelling, and still he was dragging at the problem. His harrow had been touched him on the intellectual side alone, but now his imagination was also engaged, or rather enslaved, and as he had lay and tossed in the gross darkness of the night, and he had continued curtained the room, Mr. Enfield's tale went by before his mind, and a scroll lighted the pictures. He would be aware of the great field of lamps of a nocturnal city, then of the figure of a man walking swiftly, then of a child running from the doctors, and then these met. And that human juggernaut trod the child down and passed on regardless screams. Or else he would see a room in a rich house, where his friend lay asleep, during the smiling at his dreams, and then the door of that room would be opened, the curtains of the bed would be plucked apart, the sleeper recalled, and lo, there would be stand by his side a figure to whom power was given, and even that dead hour must he rise to do his bidding. The figure in these two phases haunted the lawyer all the night, and at time he dozed over, it was but to see it glide more stealthily through sleeping hours, or move the more swiftly, and still the more swiftly, even to dizziness, though wider labyrinths of lamp-lighted city, and at every street corner crush a child and leave her screaming, and still the figure had no face by which he might know it. Even in his dreams it had no face, or one that baffled him and melted before his eyes. And thus it was that there sprang up and grew apace in the lawyer's mind and a singularly strong, almost inordinate curiosity to behold the features of the real Mr. Hyde if he could but once set eyes on him. He thought the mystery would lighten and perhaps roll altogether away, as was the habit of mysterious things when well examined. He might see a reason for his friend's strange preference or bondage, call it which you please, and even for the startling clause of will. At least it would have a face worth seeing, a face of a man who was without bowels of mercy, a face which had but to show itself to rise up in the mind of an unpassionable Enfield, a spirit of enduring hatred. From that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door in the by-street shops. In the morning before office hours, at noon when business was plenty, the time scarce, at night under the face of a fogged city moon, all by lights of the hours of solitude and composure, the lawyer was to be found out on his chosen post. If it be Mr. Hyde, he had thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. And at last his patience was rewarded. It was a fine, dry night. Frost in the air, the streets as clean as a bathroom floor, the lamps unshaken by any wind, drawing a regular pattern of light and shadow. By 10 o'clock, when the shops were closed and the by-street was very solitary and, in spite of the low growl of London from all around, very silent, small sounds carried far. Domestic sounds out of the houses were clearly audible on either side of the roadway, and the rumor of the approach of any passenger preceded him by a long time. Mr. Utterson had been some minutes at his post when he was aware of an odd, light footstep drawing near. In the course of his nightly patrols, he had long grown accustomed to the quaint effect with which the footfalls of a single person, while he was still a great way off, suddenly sprang out distinct from the vast hum and clatter of the city. Yet his attention had never before been so sharply and decisively arrested, and it was with a strong, superstitious prevision of success that he withdrew into the entry of the court. The steps drew swiftly nearer, and swelled out suddenly louder as they turned to the end of the street. The lawyer, looking forth from the entry, could soon see what manner of man he had to deal with. He was a small and very plainly dressed, and the look of him, even at the distance, went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. But he made a straight for the door, crossing the roadway to save time, and as he came, he drew a key from his pocket like one approaching home. Mr. Utterson stepped out and touched him on the shoulder as he passed. "Mr. Hyde, I think." Mr. Hyde shrank back with a hissing intake of breath, but his fear was only momentary, and though he did not look like the lawyer in the face, he answered coolly enough, "That is my name. What do you want?" "I see you are going in," returned the lawyer. "I am an old friend of Mr. Jekyll's, Mr. Utterson of the Gaunt Street. You have heard my name, and meeting you so conveniently, I thought you might admit me." "You will not find Mr. Jekyll. He is from home," replied Mr. Hyde, blowing in the key. And then, suddenly, but still without looking up, "How did you know me?" he asked. "On your side," said Mr. Utterson. "Will you do me a favor?" "With pleasure," replied the other. "What shall it be?" "You will let me see your face?" asked the lawyer. Mr. Hyde appeared to hesitate, and then, as if upon some sudden reflection, fronted about with an air of defiance. The pair stared at each other pretty fixedly for a few seconds. "Now I shall know you again," said Mr. Utterson. "It may be useful." "Yes," returned Mr. Hyde. "It is as well as we have never met. And apropos, you should have my address." And he gave a number of a street in Soho. "Good God," thought Mr. Utterson. "Can he, too, have been thinking of the will?" But he kept his feelings to himself and only grunted in acknowledgment of the address. "And now," said the other, "how did you know me?" "By the description," was a reply. "Whose description?" "We have common friends," said Mr. Utterson. "Common friends?" echoed Mr. Hyde a little hoarsely. "Who are they?" "Jekyll, for instance," said the lawyer. He never told you," cried Mr. Hyde with a flush of anger. "I did not think you would have lied." "Come," said Mr. Utterson, "that is not fitting language." The other snarled aloud into a savage laugh, and the next moment, with extraordinary quickness, he had unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. The lawyer stood a while when Mr. Hyde had left him, the picture of disquietude. Then he began slowly to mount the street, pausing every step or two and putting his hand to his brow like a man in mental perplexity. The problem was that he was thus debating as he walked, when he was one the class that is rarely solved. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile, and had borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, and as he spoke with a husky, whispering, and somewhat broken voice, all these points against him, but not all of these together could explain the hit-harrow unknown disgust, loathing, and fear which Mr. Utterson regarded him. "There must be something else," said the perplexed gentleman. "There is something more, if I could find a name for it. God bless me. And the man seems hardly human. Something troglodytic, shall we say? Or can it be the old story of Dr. Fell? Or is it mere radiance of a fool soul that has thus transpires through and transfigures its clay continent? The last, I think, for, oh, my poor old Harry Jekyll, if I ever read Satan's signature upon a face, it is that of your new friend." Round the corner from the by-street, there was a square of ancient, handsome houses, now for the most part decayed from their high estate and let flats and chambers to all sorts of connections of men, map engravers, architects, shady lawyers, and the agents of obscure enterprises. One house, however, second from the corner, was still occupied and entire, and the door of this, which wore a great air of wealth and comfort, though it was now plunged in darkness except for the fanlight, Mr. Utterson stopped and knocked. A well-dressed, entirely servant opened the door. "Is it Dr. Jekyll at home, Poole?" asked the lawyer. "I will see, Mr. Utterson," said Poole, admitting the visitor as he spoke into a large, low-roofed, comfortable hall paved with flags, warmed after the fashion of a country house by a bright open fire and furnished with costly cabinets of oak. "Will you wait here by the fire, sir, or shall I give you a light in the dining room?" "Here, thank you," said the lawyer, and he drew near and leaned on the tall fender. This hall, in which he now was left alone, was a pet fancy of his friend the doctor's, and Utterson himself was wont to speak of it as the pleasantest room in London. But tonight there was a shudder in his blood. The face of Hyde sat heavy on his memory. He felt what was rare with him, a nausea and distaste of life, and in the gloom of his spirits he seemed to read a menace of flickering of the firelight on the polished cabinets and the uneasy starting of the shadow of the roof. He was ashamed of his relief when Poole presently returned to announce that Dr. Jekyll had gone out. "I saw Mr. Hyde go in by the old dissecting room, Poole," he said. "Is that right? Dr. Jekyll is from home?" "Quite right, Mr. Utterson, sir," replied the servant. "Mr. Hyde has a key." "Your master seems to repose a great deal of trust in that young man, Poole," resumed the other musingly. "Yes, sir, he does indeed," said Poole. "We have all orders to obey him." "I do not think I have ever met Mr. Hyde," asked Utterson. "Oh, dear, no, sir. He never dines here," replied the butler. "Indeed, we have very little of him on this side of the house. He mostly comes and goes by the laboratory. Well, good night, Poole." "Good night, Mr. Utterson." And the lawyer set homeward with a very heavy heart. Poor Harry Jekyll, he thought. My mind misgives me he is in a deep waters. He was wild when he was young, a long while ago to be sure, but in the law of God there is no statute of limitations. Aye, it must be that, a ghost of some old sin, the cancer of some concealed disgrace, punishment coming predeclado, years after memory has forgotten and low self-condoned the fault. And the lawyer, scared by the thought, brooded a while on his own past, groping in all corners of memory, lest by chance some jack-in-the-box of an old iniquity and raised up again into a sober, fearful gratitude by the many he had come to so near and doing it yet avoided. And then by the return of his former subject, he conceived a spark of hope. This Mr. Hyde, he was to be studied, he thought, must have secrets of his own, black secrets. By the look of him, secrets compared to which poor Jekyll's worst would be like sunshine. Things cannot continue as if they are. It turns me cold to think of this creature stealing like a thief to Harry's beside. Poor Harry, what awakening! And the danger of it, for this Hyde to this world, if Jekyll will but let me, he added, if Jekyll will but let me, for once more he saw before his mind's eye, as clear as transparency, the strange clauses of the will.